Perfect. So I'm joining some of the comments actually that was made to Andrew's presentation. When Clara Pop said that the real value of ethnic heritage comes when it is passed on from generation to generation. And because my talk deals with what happens with some of that legacy when it travels generationally. And in particular, I'm interested in how stories are modified or um, make meaning again in a different environment when they're inherited from the parents, from the grandparents, or the great grandparents. I have been dealing with narrative research for a while. I am fascinated by how stories are told, but in particular, for what purpose these stories are told in particular conversations. So for today's talk, I picked two stories. I hope I will have time for sure for one that deals with language and speaking the heritage language, but not so much in terms of how that um, heritage language knowledge makes meaning in the storyteller's life, but how it alters the storyteller's ethnic identity position, simply knowing that her mother or his mother um, had struggled with expressing herself in certain situations. So I have been doing research about ethnic identity for a while now. I started doing that for my PhD when I interviewed 12 second and late generation Hungarian Americans about their ethnic identity. And then I started focusing on the particular stories that they told about about their relationship with their heritage, or their parents or their grandparents' relationship with their heritage. And that's when I noted that very frequently the stories that they told were actually not theirs, but they were inherited stories. And I became more interested in how retelling those inherited memories actually repositions the storyteller in a different way. So I was looking at intergenerational memory as a theme and as a structure, both from a sociolinguistic perspective, and I was trying to conceptualize themes in the personal narratives. So, and finally, I would like to draw the conclusion: what do inherited memories tell us about ethnic identity? So it's by now a relatively big database, especially considering the fact that I was doing manual transcribing and not using speech to text recognition programs. I will definitely change that in the future. And the coding of the transcripts was also manual. I tried Atlas TI, but Atlas works more for the semantic content, and it does not really um, code for structures or for performative elements. And I think with inherited memories, these are sometimes even more important than the direct vocabulary items that appear about ethnic heritage. I was looking always for the individual stories. So I wasn't looking at the interviews as case studies, talking about the life of the informant or how they functioned within the Hungarian American or European American community, because I realized that in the case of third or fourth generation Hungarian Americans, it's their heritage very often becomes mixed European heritage involving different elements, and they actually make conscious choices within that ethnic heritage from the available options, and very often that is Hungarian, which they explain using inherited stories. So these individual stories that I looked at were either Lebovian or prototypical stories, in the sense that they had an abstract, an orientation, complicating actions, evaluation, resolution, and coda. So all the six necessary parts were there, and they were telling past events in retrospect. But in many cases, intergenerational memories came up or surfaced in so-called conversational stories, which are slightly different than Lebovian or prototypical stories, in the sense that They're very often unfinished. They're more often than not connected with something very recent. So something that happens right at the moment of our interview, or just slightly before that, connects to something that is that had happened in the family a long time before. So those conversational stories are very often really exciting from the perspective of how informants construct meaning of their inherited stories. Um, these intergenerational memory narratives pointed towards potential explanations of some inexplicable phenomena, or what I called inexplicable phenomena in ethnic identity theories. First of all, we can see nowadays that there are problems with quantifiability. Even though the language in third generation ethnic communities is already something that is either there or rather not there, because it seems to be a huge challenge to speak the ancestors' language or to learn the ancestors' language at a level when it provides conversational opportunities for the person. And I'm not talking about knowing certain food names or being able to relate to ethnic heritage sites or ethnic heritage events, but really in the sense that it is spoken fluently. So, and if we try to quantify or try to number the members of the third generation community according to how they speak the ancestral language, then we obviously, as we heard from the previous two speakers, we get very, very tiny, very handful communities. But intergenerational memory stories actually challenge these ideas that we should quantify ethnic identity as such, or the members of ethnic communities, because it's a much deeper issue, and choices are offered even at times when we don't even think about them. So the changing assimilation paradigm, I think Andres and Kirai mentioned some ideas related to that. The unidirectional changes are always questioned. And Gonz's symbolic ethnicity theory held that by the third or the fourth generation, the latest, ethnicity as a measurable, quantifiable feature of identity disappears. So Gons had this very gloomy perspective, which has proved wrong ever since. But I think John Mollenkopf really put it very beautifully, saying that late generation European ethnic identity is still very much with us, even though it is lately invisible and specifically ethnic practices have been forgotten. Or, and then he goes on arguing in his article, or that these practices have been redefined and each new generation gets a chance to rediscover and to reconstruct its meaning in their own lives. And I think that's why intergenerational memory narratives can so beautifully add to this picture. So new approaches to an old concept, just real quick. Thomas Gladsky, a Polish-American literary critic, came up with this idea of transethnicity, that every new generation has the possibility to redefine the content of their ethnicity. Wilbur Zielinski and Brunner Lee came up with the idea of heterolocalism, communities that are not necessarily living together, sharing the same geographical space, but they still understand the cultural messages, or they still are familiar with the narrative paradigm of being ethnic. Bettina Hoffman and Monica Muller say that ethnic identity is a culturally constructed concept by the discourses that a society uses to make sense of itself and the world at large. So ethnicity, based on all these ideas, could be understood as a discursively constructed subjectivity position. And why I suggest that subjectivity as a term that could be used interchangeably with identity, but it actually adds to the concept of identity by the fact that it is discursive. So if you look at stories, if you look at how the stories are constructed language-wise, we can learn actually a lot about the person's identity. While identity traditionally answers the question with whom or what we identify, subjectivity answers the question, how does language create and impact the way we negotiate our similarities or differences from the other? So subjectivity is built on challenging the objectivity, pivotal to the credibility of this self. And on that note, I move on to how I look at intergenerational memory narratives. And basically, on the level of the theme itself, so what the stories are about, very often events, places, processes, what happened to the ancestors. But what is very interesting in these stories, that they always carry an existential insecurity. And this existential insecurity is traceable in Marianne Hirsch's post-memory concept as well. But I think intergenerationality means more than just this existential insecurity. What if means, what if actually it can be approached from two different perspectives. The first one is, what if the story I'm telling you or telling the public is not true or happened in a different way? This is one of the what if element, the first what if aspect. And the second one, what if it had happened differently, I would not be here. So the kind of existentialism that is involved in these stories is very visible in the way the storyteller constructs the stories, and actually what kind of themes are mentioned, or what kind of stories or event sequences are brought into the interview. And the story structure reflects intergenerationality by the presence of the not me in my own memory reserve. This is a very interesting relationship, how this happens, because normally we tell stories about ourselves, that we are things that we're proud of, or things that are meaningful to us, or things that we think could be a good experience for our listeners. But when we're telling someone else's story, then immediately the third person is not an outsider, but a third person is someone who's related to me very closely, but it's not me. So I will show some examples. And these stories all bring up the issues of time tellership, tellability, context, interpretivity, and ownership rights. Tellership means whether I have the right to tell this story, whether my ancestor granted me the copyright, in another word. Tellability is whether this is really interesting, whether this really adds any basis to who I am right now. And the themes that I so far detected in the narratives are constructing the ethnic self, assimilation experiences, those are very often present in these stories. Historical consciousness, that's actually a very exciting one. Sites of ethnic subjectivity and heterolocalism, ethnography of an imagined discourse community. This I called when informants talked about the ethnic habits, basically, that they did once and made meaning for them, but now they're reconceptualized. And language uses the sixth one. This is actually something that I'm now working on for a book chapter in the frame of language socialization. But today I just decided to speak about something else because it's really work in progress. So the first story will actually make meaning through through a very simple phenomenon in the English language, and that's the reported speech. And Deborah Tannen, a sociolinguist, calls these reported speech instances in interview narratives as imaginary or reconstructed dialogues. And she calls these sequences this way because she says that the storyteller is the storyteller probably does not remember the actual dialogue that took place with the actual words. So what is happening in these stories is that the speaker is reconstructing the dialogues. Very often just bringing several different dialogues together to construct meaning. And this is probably even more true in intergenerational memory narratives, where when it's undetectable, the truth value or the verbatimness of those stories is unjustifiable. So we can just think that, or we can only think how that reconstructed dialogue was actually born. So while in conversational storytelling, it's the here and now, it's co-constructed and no fixed event sequence. The constructed or reconstructed dialogue is invoking specific characters into the story. It's shared or entirely shed responsibilities. There is always a space for interpretation that is provided usually through evaluative comments, and agency construction is very interesting. And one thing I learned from this project regards agency versus a sense of victimhood. And this is something that should not be understood simply as saying that, oh, I'm a victim of, I don't know, whoever making this decision, but it works on a very subtle level. How they retell the story, very often it means that the storytellers reposition themselves in terms of taking responsibility for the action of the great-grandparents, the fourth generation ancestors, and they still find in very subtle linguistic ways a victim to the situation that was created back then. So that's one of the most exciting aspects, actually. So the first story, and I'm not going to read it because you probably can read it much nicer than if I would read it out. So please take a minute or so and read it. So the excerpt is actually a conversational story without explicitly stated complicating actions. It builds up the meaning of assimilation as a change regarding the individual's challenges to function in two distinct language worlds. John does not explicitly tell any memory inherited from his parents, only some vague but powerful reference to his mother's experiences from before John's birth. And that is the part that I highlighted in yellow. It seems that my prompt about his previous knowledge of Hungarian led him to think about his parents' and grandparents' language-related experiences during their relocation and subsequent assimilation. In line 3, John tells that he grew up speaking the language, which is Hungarian, in the US. This sentence displays a new language situation in the family. The factuality of the simple past tense form of the verb grow indicates that the home's dominant language was not John's choice, and that speaking a language or two languages, counting also the occasionally used German, other than English, created a unique island of being non-American in the US. The situation also reflects the implication of the home as a safe and secure place where the immigrant family's members, who had very likely never acquired English completely, could also feel comfortable. Language, as John remembers, became a wall, a fixed boundary between the inside of the home with the extended family and the outside world of American society, where they had to work and function without fully knowing the language. John's reference to the time and place of his birth orients the audience in contextualizing his memories in terms of the broad societal views concerning speaking languages other than English. Immediately after telling it, he stops and makes a narrative aside in line 5 about me knowing his age, disrupting the coherence of the event sequence. Riesman argues that with the help of asides, storytellers step out of the action to engage directly with the listener. John moves from the story world to the storytelling world and expresses his perceived vulnerability, which stems from the knowledge that I know how old he was at the time of our first interview. Although the comment is concise and does not keep the story off its original course for too long, It does work as a narrative side shadowing. The remark makes meaning in this narrative context as it opens up our dialogue to other possible directions with the lingering question, what if I judge him by the information about his age and construct differential meanings? It also alludes to information about the macro context of John's childhood in the 1960s. When John was growing up with the Hungarian language in the family, the societal context for the language knowledge other than English was still unsympathetic. Telling that when he was born makes me think of the possible implications of his knowledge of Hungarian and also his vulnerability about how accomplished he wants me to see him as being. In the second, much longer part of the cited conversation, John tells about the lingering wish of the family members he grew up with to relocate to Hungary. He explains that he is not sure how deeply his family's often discussed wish to return influenced him in his decision. The only person concerned was his mother, and John quotes his words as in a constructed dialogue in lines 14 through 19 to make a point about his assimilation. At first, my mom wasn't too sure about it. The sentence suggests that the relocation experience linked with the necessity to assimilate brings back a lot of probably very mixed negative or even traumatic memories for John's mother. John chooses not to tell them or does not know them, and I do not ask. He emphasizes and explains his mother's untold stories, not by adding more depth and detail, which would probably be more discouraging and personal, but by paraphrasing their conversations, which occurred probably more than once in the form of a constructed dialogue. Dialogue is also a very complex performative way to underscore the agency of the narrator, who by participating in it had the chance to develop his own views. In a dialogic environment, even if constructed, the voices that represent and thus interpret personal experiences get sharply separated from each other, which the audience is also factoring in with the meaning making. This time, John reconstructs the arguments of many possible dialogues into one single conversation that immediately opens up the closed time frame of the pastness. The dialogue runs short on John's responses. He only tells a few constructed direct quotes, utterances that his mother likely said in quite similar ways. In the first reporting clause, she told me, the simple past tense indicates the closeness of the conversation. Then after citing his mother's address to him, son, instead of continuing, John adds an interjection that seems superfluous tautology at the first hearing. This is her words. The clarification makes sense only in retrospect, as we read on, and it turns out that John's verbal response to his mother's concerns is missing entirely. It is a monologue summarizing many untold memories that all lead to one single consequence. One can leave, but cannot change his initial socialization in his motherland. In line 18, John would have some space to join in with his response, but instead he paraphrases the reporting clause. She says, this time changing the tense to the simple present, indicative of opinion that she still thinks it's valid about assimilation. The narrative step to dramatize the mother's experiences as pieces of advice shifts the focus from John's own experiences to involve the family's past in the process of decision-making. John confirms that he agrees it's true, but not until 2 lines later. The constructed dialogue built up the constructed direct utterances by John's mother transpires as a platform of side shadowing with the function of making temporality of the discussion between John and his mother more dynamic and lifelike, as the pastness of the narrative would suggest. So John actually had it's a very interesting experience of speaking only Hungarian until the age of 6, but then he talks about how unfriendly the American education system was at the time when he went to elementary school. So he was actually kept back a year until he learned proper English. And then he moved to Hungary and he went through the same problematic language socialization at the time when he could have focused on his professional career and professional advancement, and he was sort of stuck in this intergenerational or living through the intergenerational memories of his family experience. I just stopped sharing, and I will just conclude with the fact that just getting deeper into these intergenerational memories, we can actually realize how much information about our own identity we code or we encode into the stories, and we just pay attention to them. And much of the ethnic identification remains hidden unless we go on to that level. Thank you very much. And sorry to have it over time.